I remember a string quartet was playing near the entrance of the reception hall. The flowers were gardenias. I remember the smell more than the sight of them, something sweet and heavy that mixed with whatever they were serving at the open bar. The venue was in the old part of the city, one of those buildings that had been renovated carefully over the years, exposed brick and warm lighting that made everyone look slightly better than they did in ordinary life. It was a good party. I want to be clear about that before I say anything else. Whatever happened later that night, the hours before it were genuine. The ceremony was beautiful, my sister Bev was happy, and the man she married seemed like someone who would take care of her in the particular way she needed to be taken care of. I was glad to be there. My father's hand went flat on the table. He does that when he's been preparing something. A flat hand, fingers spread, slight pressure against the surface, like he's anchoring himself before he speaks. I learned to read it before I could have explained what it meant. "Nora," he said, "we need to talk about the Beaumont house." He said it the way you'd say something that had been waiting for a reasonable moment. Quietly, between the main course and dessert, with the band warming up on the other side of the room. The Beaumont house. 3 bedrooms. A kitchen where I spent 3 separate weekends choosing tile before I got it right. A back porch that faces a line of oak trees, old enough to have been there before the house was built. I spent 4 years saving for the down payment. I drove there alone on a Saturday in March after the offer was accepted and stood in the backyard for a long time without saying anything to anyone because there was no one there to say it to. My name is Nora, and what my father said next is why I was on the highway home before the wedding cake was ever cut. Subscribe if you haven't. New story every day. I should tell you something about what I was when I walked into that reception. I am 43. I work in petroleum engineering, subsurface work, which means I spend a great deal of time analyzing data about what lies underground, and a fair amount of time on offshore platforms in the Gulf of Mexico. I had flown in from a 3-week rotation 2 days before the wedding. I'd bought a dress in a 20-minute window between meetings and worn it with heels I was regretting by the cocktail hour. I've been doing this work for nearly 20 years. It has compensated me well for a long time. I have an apartment in Houston that I paid $350,000 for, and I have the house in Beaumont that I paid $500,000 for. Both of them are mine without condition. I did not come from money. I did not marry into money. I did not inherit or receive a windfall or have a door opened for me that wouldn't have opened otherwise. I know that sounds like a statement people make to establish something, and I suppose it is, but what I mean is something more specific than pride. I mean that every number on those mortgage payoffs was preceded by a year of choosing it over something else, and the choosing was deliberate, and the deliberateness was the point. Bev's wedding was the first time in nearly 2 years that our whole family, my parents, Bev, and I, had been in the same room. I had thought, somewhere on the flight over, that it might be a good chance to reset a few things, to just be together and remember what that felt like before things got complicated. I didn't know yet how the night would end. I left Dallas at 18 to study engineering in Houston. My parents hadn't opposed it. They also hadn't helped fund it, which I understood from the beginning. My father ran an electrical contracting business that did reasonably well. My mother taught elementary school for 20 years, and they were comfortable, but not surplus. I wasn't owed anything beyond what they'd been able to give me growing up. I knew that, and I accepted it without drama. What I hadn't fully prepared for was what it actually felt like to operate on my own at that scale. My student loans covered tuition and a dormitory for the first year. The second year, I moved into an apartment with 2 other engineering students to split costs. $450 a month for a room that fit a bed, a desk, and a small bookshelf that doubled as a dresser. I found part-time work at a gas station 3 blocks from campus. 4 shifts a week, Thursday through Sunday, 4 in the afternoon to 10 at night. I've always found something quietly funny about that detail, given what I ended up doing for a living. But at 20, I wasn't thinking about the irony. I was thinking about making rent. The work was fine. I was good at it. I learned quickly which customers needed help with the pump, which ones wanted the transaction to be invisible, which ones were having a bad night and needed someone to briefly acknowledge that. There is a kind of attention you develop when you're doing a job that people look through rather than at, and I've carried that attention into every room I've been in since. It served me well. I called home on Sundays when I could. The calls were short and covered the surface of things. My mother would tell me about a difficult student, a staff meeting that ran long, something she'd seen on the drive to school that struck her. My father would ask if I was eating enough. Bev, still in high school then, would sometimes grab the phone and tell me about something that had happened that week, with the particular urgency that teenage life carries. The calls were warm enough. There wasn't much room in them for what I was actually managing day to day, and I didn't try to make room. It felt like it would only worry them, and worrying them wouldn't fix anything. My parents visited once in the spring of my second year. They drove down on a Friday and stayed in a hotel about 2 miles from my apartment. I showed them the campus, the engineering building, the library where I spent most of my waking hours that weren't spent at the gas station. We had dinner on Friday night and again on Saturday. They were kind and slightly formal in the way you are with someone you're beginning to realize you know less about than you thought. My mother hugged me for a long time on Sunday morning before they drove back. I was 20 years old that spring. A utility bill had come in higher than I'd budgeted for, and when I checked my account, I had $11 and 3 weeks until my next paycheck. I stood in the gas station parking lot after my shift on a Tuesday afternoon and looked at my phone. I thought about calling home. I thought about the shape that conversation would take. My mother's voice going quiet, my father running the numbers out loud, both of them feeling helpless, all of us feeling worse at the end of it. I put the phone in my pocket. I went back inside and asked if I could pick up an extra shift that week. My manager said yes. I ate rice and canned beans for the next 2 weeks. I covered the bill, and I didn't make the same mistake again. Bev's path looked different. She stayed in Dallas for her degree, lived at home for the first 2 years, and in her junior year, her car broke down and my parents bought her a replacement. She told me about it on a Sunday call, excited, describing the color. I said something enthusiastic, and I meant it. It wasn't a comparison I was making. I genuinely wanted things to be easier for her than they'd been for me. If my parents could give her that ease, I was glad for it. I graduated third in my class on a Thursday in May. I sent the date and the time home. My father had a project he couldn't reschedule. My mother said the drive was a lot for a weekday. 2 friends from my program sat in the audience, and we went out for dinner afterward, and I ordered a glass of wine that cost more than I'd usually spend on a full meal, and it tasted exactly right. The years after graduation were the years I built things in. A first job in Houston, then a better one 2 years later. A move into offshore work at 26 that frightened me more than I let on, and then didn't frighten me, and then became the place where I was most fully operational. A mentor at 30 who sat across from me in a conference room and told me plainly what I was doing well and where I was leaving progress on the table. And I took both halves of that seriously and came back a year later with evidence. By 34, I was earning more in a year than my parents had earned in 5. I did not say this to them. I thought about it in the abstract. The way you think about how far you've come when you're driving back from somewhere, and the distance only registers in the rear view. The first offshore rotation I did was in the fall after I turned 26, a platform 90 miles out in the Gulf, 3 weeks on and 3 weeks off, a crew of people who had been doing the work so long they moved around the platform without thinking about it. I was not like that yet. The first morning, I went up to the main deck before my shift started and looked at the water in every direction. Nothing on the horizon but more water and more sky, and felt something I didn't have a ready category for. Not fear exactly, something more like the recognition of scale, the understanding that I was very small and very far from anything I had known, and that this was, for the foreseeable future, going to be my life. Within a month, I had stopped thinking about the distance. By the second rotation, I was sleeping through the weather that had kept me awake the first time. That is the thing about environments that frighten you initially. They don't stop being what they are, but you stop registering them the same way. What remained was the work itself, which I found I was good at in a way that went past competence into something closer to genuine interest. I bought the apartment in Houston at 36. $350,000, ground floor of a building I'd walked past enough times to know I wanted to live there. I signed the papers on a Friday afternoon and took myself to dinner that night, alone, at a place with tablecloths, and I ordered everything I wanted off the menu and sat at the table for 2 hours and thought about the version of me in that parking lot 16 years before and felt something I've never quite found the right word for. The Beaumont house came 5 years later. It was not a rational choice in anyone's framework but mine. I had passed through Beaumont twice on long drives and noticed something in it each time. A pace, a quality of the afternoon light, oak trees that had been there longer than the houses around them, a main street with a hardware store that smelled like hardware stores used to smell, a bakery, a diner where the woman behind the counter remembered your order by the third visit. I started looking at listings without telling anyone, the way you do when you're entertaining something you're not prepared to be asked questions about. The house I found wasn't the first I looked at. It was the third. It had been on the market for 90 days, priced slightly under what I'd budgeted, with a back porch that faced east and a kitchen with good bones and old tile that I replaced across 3 separate weekends of driving down with samples and holding them against the light. I made the offer on a Thursday. It was accepted that weekend. I drove there alone the following Saturday in March and stood in the backyard and looked at the oak trees and understood for the first time in a long time that I had been working towards something specific and had now arrived at it. A couple named the Garcias moved in 2 years ago. They have a dog, a patient one that sits near the fence when they're in the backyard. They planted a vegetable garden that first summer and sent me a photo of the first tomatoes. I was offshore when the photo came through. I looked at it for a while before I put my phone away. Bev had visited the house once before the Garcias moved in. She walked through the rooms and said it was beautiful, and she meant it. Bev is not someone who performs things she doesn't feel. The wedding weekend started without any sign of what was coming. Thursday was the rehearsal dinner. 60 people, a private room at a downtown restaurant, speeches that were well-timed and occasionally funny and landed the way they were meant to. I sat next to my aunt and her husband for most of the evening. She's been gardening seriously for 20 years, and she talked about it with the precision of someone who finds the subject genuinely inexhaustible. I was happy to listen. My parents were across the room, and we waved at each other a few times through the crowd. Friday, I had mostly to myself. I walked the city for a few hours, found a coffee shop, sat with a book I'd been meaning to finish since the platform. Bev called in the afternoon to ask if I needed anything. I said no. She said she was nervous. I told her that was allowed and that she was going to be fine, and she said she knew, which meant she didn't quite believe it yet, which is the correct way to feel the day before you get married, Saturday. The ceremony was in a garden behind a converted property outside the city. The sky held. Bev walked down an aisle edged with white flowers, and Tom stood at the end of it looking like a man who understood precisely what was happening and was choosing it without reservation. My parents stood beside me. My mother cried. My father put his arm around her and left it there. I photographed that on my phone. The reception was at a venue downtown. The quartet in the entrance hall, the band in the main room, dinner at round tables with white linens. I was seated with extended family and some of Tom's people, his sister, a college friend, an uncle who told a story about Tom at 13 that made everyone at the table laugh. The evening was uncomplicated in the way that good evenings are. Things worked the way they were supposed to, and no one was trying too hard. The main course was cleared. The band took a short break. People moved between tables, headed to the bar, gathered near the small dance floor that had opened up at the far end of the room. My father appeared at my left elbow. "Come sit with us for a minute," he said, nodding toward a table near the back of the room where my mother was waiting. She already had a glass of water in front of her and her hands folded on the table. That is also a position I recognize. My father sat across from me and started with the Garcias. Had they renewed their lease, he asked. I said they had, through the end of next year. He nodded. "Good tenants," he said. I agreed. He said he and my mother had been thinking about Bev and Tom, about what they were starting with. He laid it out carefully, the way he presents things he's thought through. Tom had steady work but limited savings. Bev worked part-time at a nonprofit, meaningful to her, not high earning. Together, they were looking at renting an apartment in the city, probably $1,800 a month at the low end. Over 10 years, he said, that was close to $250,000 in rent. Money they'd spend and never see again. You have the apartment in Houston, he said. You live there. That makes sense. And then you have Beaumont. You don't live there, it's rented out. He let that sit. We thought, he said, that you might consider passing Beaumont to Bev and Tom as a gift, to give them something real to start with. I looked at him. I looked at my mother. Then I said no. My father received the word the way he receives things he's expected to need to work around. Patient, unhurried. I understand your first reaction, he said, but think about what it would actually mean for her. They'd have a place, a real place. They wouldn't spend the next decade building nothing. Beaumont is an hour and a half from the city, I said. Tom works downtown. People commute. That's 3 hours a day. They could rent it for a while first, build equity, eventually sell and put that towards something closer. I noticed, from somewhere steady and detached, that this plan involved selling a house I had bought. I said, Beaumont is not a rental investment I'm holding on to. I bought it because I plan to live there eventually. That's the reason I bought it. But not now. Not now, but it's mine. My mother shifted. She'd been watching the exchange with the stillness of someone who had already decided what she was going to say. Nora, she said, you have 2 properties. I'm aware of what I have. Bev has nothing. She and Tom are starting from zero. Then they'll build from zero. That's what most people do. You could make it easier for her. I could. I'm choosing not to. The words came out more directly than I'd planned. My mother's expression changed. Not dramatically, just a slight closing down around the eyes. You have more than enough, she said. You know that. Everyone at this table knows that. And I'm asking you, on your sister's wedding day, to do something for her that would cost you... What exactly? A house you don't live in? A house you visit twice a year? That's what you're holding on to. I'm holding on to something that's mine, I said. That's the whole reason. A pause. It's selfish, my mother said. Not loud, just flat and clear, as though she'd moved past the diplomatic version. I'm sorry, but it is. You have 2 paid properties, and you won't give your sister the one you don't live in. What is that, if not selfish? I didn't answer. My father said her name, low, a hand on the table. She didn't stop. And I'll say the other thing too, since we're here. I've watched you over the years. I've watched what this career has done. I'm proud of you, Nora, I mean that. But there's something that's changed. The way you hold things, the way you talk about what's yours. Money changes people. I've seen it happen, and I've seen it happen with you. You weren't always like this. I thought, in the moment she said it, about an $11 bank balance and a parking lot on a Tuesday night and a decision not to call home. I thought about a graduation ceremony in May with 2 friends in the audience. I thought about every Sunday call in which the question of how I was actually doing had not quite made it to the surface. I didn't say any of that. I heard Bev's voice somewhere behind me. She'd come looking for me, probably for the cake or photos, and she'd registered something in the picture we made at that small table. She was standing a few feet back in her wedding dress. "What's going on?" she said. I looked at her. She looked exactly the way she was supposed to look. Put together, slightly flushed from dancing, happy in the way that's still fragile enough to be disrupted. I didn't want to be the disruption. "Nothing that has to be yours tonight," I said. I picked up my bag. I took Bev's hand and held it for a moment and told her it had been a genuinely beautiful wedding, and I meant it. I said goodbye to my father, who stood when I pushed back my chair. My mother didn't stand. I walked through the reception. past the band, which had started up again, past the bar, through the entrance hall where the quartet was on their break, eating off a catering tray near the door. Outside, the night air was 15 degrees cooler than the room and smelled like a parking lot, which is to say it smelled like nothing. I found my car. I sat in it with the engine off. I gave myself 10 minutes to feel whatever I was actually feeling. Then I drove back to the hotel. Bev called the next morning at 9. I let it ring and listened to the voicemail afterward, sitting on the edge of the hotel bed with the curtains still closed. She said she hadn't been able to get a clear answer from anyone about what had happened. She said she wasn't upset with me. She wanted to understand. Her voice was careful, and underneath the carefulness, genuinely hurt in the way that is harder to hear than anger. She said she was sorry if the evening had been difficult. I texted her. The wedding was beautiful. I mean that. Flying home this afternoon. Let's talk soon. My father sent a message that evening. Take some time. No rush on anything. My mother sent nothing. I flew home Monday morning and had a rotation starting Wednesday. I packed what I needed, dealt with the mail that had backed up, went over some data I needed to be current on before I got back on the platform. Going offshore when there's something unresolved at home is a particular kind of relief that I've found difficult to explain to people who haven't experienced it. The platform doesn't carry any of the information from your life on land. The water doesn't know what was said at a table at a wedding reception. The work is right in front of you and it requires your full attention. And for the hours that it requires you, you are nowhere else. But there are hours between shifts. Early mornings before the first briefing. The quiet after dinner when the platform settles into its own rhythms and there's no particular place you're needed. In those hours, what my mother had said came back. Money changes people. I held that sentence for a long time. I tried to hold it the way she'd meant it, to look at it honestly and see whether there was something in it I was resisting for reasons I hadn't examined. I was 20 years old when I had $11 and 3 weeks until rent. I'd made a calculation error on a utility bill and hadn't caught it until the account was already wrong. I stood in the parking lot after my shift and thought about calling home, and I thought about the shape the conversation would take. My mother's voice going quiet, my father trying to problem solve out loud, both of them feeling helpless at a distance, all of us ending the call feeling worse than before. So I didn't call. I went back in and picked up an extra shift and stretched a bag of rice and some canned beans further than I thought I could. And I was fine by the time the next paycheck came, and I didn't make that particular mistake again. I was 22 when the engineering department held a small awards ceremony, an afternoon event. I sent the date home. My father had a commercial project booked for weeks. My mother said it was a long drive for a few hours on a Thursday. I walked across the stage and shook the department chair's hand and had my photo taken in front of a banner. And afterward, 2 friends bought me a drink, and I was genuinely glad they were there. I was 28 when a promotion changed my compensation in a meaningful way. The first year I could calculate, without doing precise math, that I had earned more than both my parents combined. I took myself to dinner at a restaurant I'd been wanting to try. I sat at the bar alone and ordered everything I wanted and stayed for 2 hours and thought about the person who had stood in that gas station parking lot 8 years before and felt something I still don't have an exact name for. I did not call home to tell them about the promotion. I've thought about why, and I think it was this. I had already learned not to share the difficult things because sharing them produced helplessness and then a strained quality in the calls that followed. Sharing the good things began to feel like the same problem in reverse. They would feel something complicated about a number that didn't connect to anything they could picture, and then the calls after that would have a different strained quality. So I kept it to myself. By then, keeping things to myself was simply how I operated, and I was neither bitter about it nor particularly conscious of it. It was just what had happened to me over the years of being far away. None of these were exceptional events. That's the thing I kept returning to on the platform. I hadn't been mistreated. I hadn't been abandoned. I had parents who loved me in the way they knew how. And the way they knew how had a limited range at the moments I most needed it. And I had worked inside and then beyond that range without drama or resentment. It was just what had happened. So when my mother said money had changed me, I tried to look at it squarely. Was there a version of me, accumulated over years of having enough and then more than enough, who had become someone who held on too tightly, who would confuse the asset with the point of the thing? I thought about it honestly, I hope. I came back to the same answer every time. What I had been asked to give away was the thing I had worked longest and most deliberately toward. I wasn't holding it out of greed. I was holding it because it was mine, in a way that went all the way down, and someone had told me at a table that this wasn't a good enough reason. That didn't feel like arrogance to me. It felt like the simplest thing I could name. What I came to understand, not that night and not on the platform, but slowly over the weeks that followed, was that my parents operated from a framework I recognized but had never shared. In their framework, resources within a family exist in something like an informal common pool. When someone close to you needs something and you have the means to provide it, you provide it. What's yours is yours in the legal sense, of course, but in the moral sense, in the sense that matters to them. When a family member is struggling, you rebalance. This was not greed. I want to be accurate about that. My parents were not asking for anything for themselves. They genuinely believed that what they were asking was right, that a person who has 2 properties should help her sister have one, and that a person who refuses has misunderstood something essential about what family means. I could see the logic. I could trace its origin in the way they'd grown up, in the family stories I'd heard over the years about aunts and cousins and neighbors who'd helped each other through difficult stretches. It made a certain kind of sense. What I could not reconcile was how selectively it had applied. The logic of the common pool had not reached me when I was 20, with $11 until rent. The collective family calendar had not rearranged itself when I was 22 and walking across a graduation stage with no one I knew in the audience. The understanding that we helped each other when we could, that understanding had not taken a concrete form in any of the years I was working my way up from nothing. The logic of the common pool was being applied to what Nora had built, not to what Nora had needed. I don't think my parents saw it that way. I genuinely believe they didn't. I think they saw a daughter who had done well and a daughter who needed a start, and the path between those 2 things looked clear and good to them. They were not trying to take something from me. They were trying to give something to Bev. Those are not the same thing, but they sat close enough together that I understand why the gap was invisible to them. As for the other thing, money changed you. I turned it around slowly. The person who stood in that parking lot at 20 made a decision not to call home, went back inside and picked up an extra shift. She was making decisions based on what she could sustain. She wasn't asking for things she didn't think she was owed. She worked for what she had, and she understood that what she had was hers. That was not a new person, built by accumulation and success. That was the only person I had ever been. Money hadn't changed me. Money had made it possible to be that person without the constant friction of not having enough. The absence of friction, seen from the outside, may have looked like a different kind of person. But it wasn't. It was the same person, finally unobstructed. What my mother was seeing, I think, and this took the longest to sit with, was that when I was struggling, my way of managing it was invisible to her. I adjusted, said I was fine, figured it out. Now that I had enough, my saying no was suddenly visible. Suddenly, a character statement. The no had always been in me. They just hadn't heard it directed at anyone but myself. My father called 6 weeks after the wedding, a Sunday, which is when he calls. We talked about work, a project his company had finished near Plano, a bid he was putting together for a commercial complex in Fort Worth. My recent rotation, the project I was working through, a colleague who had retired after 31 years and whose absence on the floor was something everyone was still adjusting to. Near the end of the call, he said, "I want to say something about what happened at the wedding." I said, "Go ahead. I understand that the Beaumont house is your property, your decision." That wasn't mine to push on, and I did, and I shouldn't have. It was not quite an apology. It was in the vicinity of one. The version you get when someone still believes, in some part of themselves, that they were right, but has decided the relationship matters more than being right out loud. I had learned a long time ago to receive what was actually being offered rather than hold out for a different form. I appreciate that, I said. Your mother, he started, then redirected. She feels things strongly. She'll come around in her own time. I said I hoped so. We talked for another 10 minutes about nothing in particular and then said goodbye. My mother called once, about 8 weeks after the wedding, a Sunday afternoon. I answered. She asked how I was. I said fine. How was she? Fine. A pause that had a lot of history in it. I want you to know that it hurt, she said. What happened? It still does. I know, I said. I thought maybe by now you might see it a little differently. I said I still saw it the same. She made a small sound, not a word, just a sound, and then said, okay. She said she wasn't going to keep pushing. She said to take care of myself. She didn't mention the house specifically. We hung up. Bev and I talked about once a month. She brought up the reception directly once, about 10 weeks after it happened. She said she'd figured out what had been going on at that table, and she understood why I'd done what I did, and she wished our parents had found a different time and place. She said she wasn't going to make me explain myself to her. I told her I didn't hold any of it against her. That was true without qualification. A few months later, she sent me a photo. She and Tom had settled into an apartment in a neighborhood she liked, close to a park and a coffee shop she'd already become a regular at. The photo was of their living room, a blue couch, a bookshelf they'd built together that leaned slightly to the left, a plant on the window ledge with new growth coming in at the top. She'd written one word underneath it. Home. I looked at that photo for a while. I visited Beaumont in October, between rotations. The Garcias were away for the long weekend and had left a key under the clay pot by the back door, the same arrangement we'd had since they moved in. I walked through the rooms in the afternoon. They had changed a few things over 2 years. A lamp I didn't recognize, a rug in the hallway that was theirs, a line of photos in frames near the bedroom door. The house had taken on the texture of people who cared about where they lived. That was what I had wanted for it. The vegetable garden in the back had been put to bed for winter. The soil was turned and raked, the stakes still upright, the rows neat and waiting for spring. I stood on the back porch and looked at the oak trees for a while. October light in that part of Texas does something that's hard to describe to someone who hasn't been there at that time of year. It comes in lower, slower, and at a color that makes everything look as though it's been thought about. The trees held it differently than they did in summer. I had stood in this same backyard on a Saturday in March and thought, this is what I was working toward. I still thought that. Exactly that, without revision or amendment. I wasn't making a point. I hadn't won something. I had kept what was mine, and the keeping of it had cost me something I was still measuring. A distance with my mother that I didn't know how to close. A changed quality in the family that might or might not resolve itself over time. Those were real costs. I wasn't pretending they weren't. But I was standing in the backyard of a house I had chosen, alone, on a quiet afternoon in October, and there was no one I needed to account to for being there. I locked up when I left and drove toward the highway with the windows down until the temperature made that impractical. On the edge of the city, I stopped at the diner on the main street. I sat at the counter. The woman who usually worked the morning shift was there in the afternoon for some reason, and she recognized me from previous visits. "How are the Garcias?" she asked. I said they were good. She brought coffee without being asked and went back to what she'd been doing. I sat there for a while, not thinking about anything particular, just the coffee, the counter, the sound of something on the grill in the back. There are moments that ask nothing of you, and I've learned to recognize them as a kind of luck. This was one of them. Outside, the October light was starting to go. The main street was quiet in the way small cities go quiet early on a Saturday. Most things closed, a few lights coming on in the restaurant windows. I finished the coffee, left what I owed plus something extra, and walked back to the car. The Garcias renewed for another year in December. Bev's lease came up in the spring and she and Tom stayed in their apartment, the one with the uneven bookshelf and the plant on the window. My mother hasn't brought up Beaumont since the October call. My father phones on Sundays. Some things come back to level, and some things find a new level that is different from what it was. And sometimes you don't know which one you're living in until enough time has passed to tell the difference. I don't spend much time on it anymore. There are other things. The tomato photo is still on my phone. The Garcias had a good season.